It was the final week of February 2026. The world held its breath as the skies over the Persian Gulf and the Iranian plateau burned. In a coordinated, overwhelming, and highly classified operation, United States and Israeli aerospace forces executed a series of massive decapitation strikes. Penetrating deep into heavily defended Iranian airspace, utilizing B-2 Spirit stealth bombers and F-35 Iyadir fighters, they systematically dismantled the upper echelons of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC) command structure and cratered the entrances to Iran's deeply buried nuclear enrichment facilities. It was a display of technological and kinetic supremacy that shocked the globe. But the reaction from Tehran was immediate, apocalyptic, and entirely predictable. The Iranian military, reeling from the decapitation strikes, lashed out with the one absolute, undeniable strategic weapon they possessed. They closed the Strait of Hormuz. Within 48 hours, the 33-kilometer-wide maritime choke point, the jugular vein through which 20% of the world's crude oil flows, was seeded with naval contact mines and bracketed by road-mobile, shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles hidden in the mountainous terrain of Qeshm Island. Swarms of Shahid loitering munitions and fast-attack speedboats poured into the Gulf of Oman. Commercial supertankers, carrying the lifeblood of the industrialized world, were set ablaze. The global energy market did not just panic, it suffered a catastrophic cardiac arrest. In Washington, D.C., the newly established Trump administration mobilized for a massive, protracted naval conflict. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, was ordered to clear the strait, escort the tankers, and destroy the Iranian coastal defenses. But the Pentagon quickly realized that fighting a multi-domain, attritional war against thousands of cheap drones and ballistic missiles requires an immense volume of ships and an endless supply of interceptor missiles. They could not do it alone without stripping the rest of the globe of American naval power. The White House picked up the phone. The demand sent to the capitals of the Western Alliance was not a polite request. It was a heavy-handed, transactional ultimatum. The message from the Oval Office was clear. We are securing the oil that powers your economies. You will send your warships to the Gulf, you will share the financial burden, and you will fight alongside us. For over a century, the unwritten, unbreakable rule of Australian foreign policy was absolute. Where the United States and the United Kingdom went to war, Australia followed. From the trenches of the Western Front, to the jungles of Vietnam, to the deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan, Australia was the ultimate, reliable deputy sheriff. They always said yes. So, when the call came from Washington in late February 2026, demanding the immediate deployment of Australian guided missile destroyers to the Strait of Hormuz, the world expected the standard, immediate compliance. But Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese looked at the intelligence briefings. He looked at the massive, mobilized Chinese fleet operating in the South China Sea. He looked at the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of the Australian naval order of battle. And in a historic, geopolitical earthquake that severed a century of muscle memory, Australia delivered a blunt, uncompromising answer to the President of the United States. No. Welcome to Doctrine of War. Today we are executing a forensic, deep-dive tactical analysis into the most controversial, ruthless, and misunderstood strategic decision of the 21st century. Here is the thesis for this episode. The era of the do-it-all Navy is officially dead. You cannot fight a high-intensity, peer-to-peer conflict in the Indo-Pacific if your most capable, lethal warships are stuck dodging cheap suicide drones 10,000 miles away in a Middle Eastern sandbox. If you are beginning to understand why the true metrics of national survival are not based on diplomatic popularity contests, but on the cold, unforgiving mathematics of magazine depth, fleet availability, and geographic discipline, hit that like button and subscribe to Doctrine of War. We strip away the political spin, the media outrage, and the simplistic narratives to bring you the kinetic, logistical realities of how the free world actually fights, prioritizes, and deters. Your support ensures we can keep delivering this level of uncompromising strategic analysis. When the news broke that Canberra refused the Trump administration's demand to send warships to the Iran war, the international media went into a frenzy. American pundits screamed that the AUKUS alliance was fracturing. They accused Australia of cowardice, of isolationism, and of abandoning its closest ally in its hour of need. Domestic critics pointed out the blinding, terrifying hypocrisy of Australia refusing to protect the very oil shipments that its own fragile, imported economy relies upon to survive. They are all completely, fundamentally missing the point. Australia's refusal is not an act of pacifism. It is a masterclass in strategic realism. It is the realization that the West is currently facing a massive, globally coordinated trap. and Australia is refusing to take the bait. We are going to break down the brutal fleet math, the Hobart dilemma, and why deploying a single Australian destroyer to the Middle East guarantees the collapse of the nation's air defense umbrella in the Pacific. We are going to expose the secret war, the highly classified reality that Australian submariners and surveillance aircraft are actually fighting the Iranians right now, drawing first blood for the AUKUS pact in the shadows. And we will analyze the political fracture, why a hardened middle power is demanding clear exit strategies, refusing to bleed its economy for a forever war without a defined objective. Let us begin by looking at the hardware, the steel, and the terrifying vulnerability of the Australian continent, and why the math simply does not allow for a Middle Eastern adventure. The Pacific Trap. To understand why the Australian Prime Minister looked the President of the United States in the eye and refused to send a warship, you must strip away the emotion of the alliance and look exclusively at the rigid, uncompromising constraints of naval procurement. The Royal Australian Navy (RAN) is a highly trained, technologically supreme force. Its sailors are among the best in the world. But it is incredibly, dangerously small. When it comes to providing top-tier, wide-area integrated air and missile defense (IAMD), the entire defense architecture of the Australian continent and its deployed expeditionary forces relies on exactly 3 ships: the Hobart-class guided missile destroyers, HMAS Hobart, HMAS Brisbane, and HMAS Sydney. These 7,000-ton warships are masterpieces of naval engineering. They are equipped with the American Aegis Baseline 9 combat system and the Spy-1DV, phased array radar. They carry 48 vertical launch system (VLS) cells packed with SM-2 interceptor missiles, evolved Sea Sparrow missiles (ESSM), and long-range Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. They are designed to project an impenetrable dome of air defense over a naval task group or a coastal city, capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously and swatting supersonic cruise missiles out of the sky. If the U.S. Fifth Fleet needs a ship to survive the saturation drone and ballistic missile attacks currently raining down in the Strait of Hormuz, the Hobart class is the exact, perfect tool for the job. But here is the crushing reality of naval logistics, known as the rule of threes. In any advanced navy, if you own 3 ships of a specific class, you effectively only have one available for immediate combat deployment at any given time. One ship is almost always in dry dock undergoing deep, long-term maintenance and capability upgrades. The second ship is undergoing training, crew certification, and workup exercises. The third ship is fully operational, loaded with munitions and ready to deploy. This means that out of an entire continent of 26 million people, the Royal Australian Navy only possesses 1, perhaps 2 if pushed to the absolute breaking point of operational exhaustion, operational Hobart-class destroyers on any given day. This is the definition of a zero-sum fleet. If you move a ship from point A to point B, you do not just increase your capability at point B, you completely, totally eradicate your capability at point A, leaving the front door open. If the Australian government bows to the political pressure from Washington and orders its sole operational Hobart-class destroyer to sail 10,000 miles to the Persian Gulf, the strategic consequences for the Indo-Pacific are immediate and terrifying. The transit alone takes weeks. Once the ship arrives in the Middle East, it is locked into a grinding, high-intensity 6-month deployment cycle. During those 6 months, the entire Australian continent, and the critical maritime choke points of the Southeast Asian archipelago to its north, are completely stripped of their primary naval air defense umbrella. Let us wargame the scenario that terrifies the strategic planners in Canberra. While the Australian destroyer is busy depleting its multi-million-dollar SM-2 magazines shooting down $10,000 Iranian Shahid drones in the Gulf of Oman, the Chinese Communist Party decides that the West is sufficiently distracted and overextended. Beijing initiates a massive, rapid escalation in the South China Sea. They begin aggressively blockading the Philippines, cutting off resupply to the BRP Sierra Madre on the Second Thomas Shoal. Or worse, they launch a sudden, overwhelming quarantine and amphibious assault on Taiwan. The United States Indo-Pacific Command, INDOPACOM, desperate for mass, immediately signals its allies for assistance. The Australian Defence Force is ordered to deploy a naval task group into the Philippine Sea to support the American carrier strike groups, or to protect the critical northern approaches of the Australian mainland from Chinese long-range H-6K bombers. But the ADF cannot respond. Without the Hobart-class destroyer to provide the Aegis air defense shield, the Australian Navy cannot safely deploy its massive, highly vulnerable Canberra-class amphibious assault ships, LHDs, or its critical supply ships into contested waters. The aging Anzac-class frigates, while capable, do not possess the radar horizon, the processing power, or the magazine depth to survive a saturation attack by modern Chinese YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles. By sending the Hobart to the Middle East, Australia effectively neuters its own entire surface fleet in the Pacific. It renders the Royal Australian Navy impotent in its own backyard during the most dangerous geopolitical crisis of the 21st century. Furthermore, a warship operating in the intense high-threat environment of the Strait of Hormuz will rapidly deplete its magazines. It will suffer intense wear and tear on its gas turbine engines. If that ship is suddenly recalled to fight a high-end war against China in the Pacific, it will arrive late with empty launch cells, exhausted sailors, and a degraded combat system. The Australian strategic planners ran the math, and the conclusion was undeniable. The Pacific trap created by a Middle Eastern deployment is an unacceptable, existential risk to national sovereignty. The Hobart-class destroyers are the ultimate, finite resource of the Australian military. They must be kept in the Pacific, their magazines full, their radars spinning, ready to face the primary adversary. Australia didn't abandon America. Australia refused to leave the front door of the Indo-Pacific wide open. The nuance of the refusal. The headlines across the globe screamed that Australia had walked away from the fight. Politicians in Washington accused Canberra of enjoying the American security umbrella without being willing to pay the blood and treasure required to maintain it. But the headlines, as they often do, missed the highly classified, nuanced reality of modern multi-domain warfare. Australia did not walk away from the Iran war. They simply refused to fight it on television. They refused to get bogged down in a highly visible, attritional, symmetric escort mission that plays directly to the strengths of the adversary. Instead, Australia is fighting a high-tech, covert war, providing the absolute critical enablers that the United States military desperately needs, while keeping its heavy surface combatants safely anchored in the Pacific. In March 2026, just weeks after Albanese's public refusal to send warships, a massive twin-engine aircraft quietly lifted off from a runway in the Northern Territory and began a long transit across the Indian Ocean. It touched down at Al Minhad Air Base in the United Arab Emirates. It was a Royal Australian Air Force E-7A Wedgetail Airborne Early Warning and Control (AEWNC) aircraft. To the untrained eye, it looks like a modified Boeing 737 airliner with a strange, surfboard-like structure mounted on its spine. To the commanders of the U.S. Central Command (CENTCOM), it is the most valuable piece of airspace management technology on the planet. The Wedgetail houses the multi-role electronically scanned array MESA radar. This radar does not spin. It stares. It can track hundreds of airborne and maritime targets simultaneously over vast distances, peering deep into Iranian airspace, detecting the launch of loitering munitions and cruise missiles the moment they leave their hidden launchers. Munitions and cruise missiles the moment they leave their hidden launchers. The United States Air Force currently suffers from a massive capability gap in this specific area, as their ancient E-3 Sentry AWACS fleet is aging out and their own domestic Wedgetails are not yet fully operational in sufficient numbers. By deploying the RAF Wedgetail to the UAE, Australia provided the radar brain for the entire coalition. The Australian crew sitting in the back of that aircraft is actively managing the chaotic, lethal airspace over the Persian Gulf. When an Iranian drone swarm launches, the Australian tactical coordinators instantly calculate the intercept vectors and securely data link the firing solutions directly to American F-35s, British Typhoons, and U.S. Navy destroyers. Australia is directing the kills. They are providing the omniscient, unblinking eye that allows the coalition to swat the drones out of the sky, but they are doing it from 30,000 feet, safely behind the front lines, without risking a $2 billion surface ship to a cheap ballistic missile. It is a masterclass in asymmetric contribution. AUKUS First Blood, the submarine revelation. But the radar plane was only the prelude. The true extent of Australia's involvement in the 2026 Iran war was hidden hundreds of feet below the surface of the ocean, and it represents one of the most explosive military revelations of the decade. In mid-March, news leaked through highly classified channels, later quietly confirmed by anonymous Pentagon officials, regarding a brutal, subsurface engagement in the Gulf of Oman. An Iranian Kilo-class diesel-electric submarine, attempting to lay a covert minefield in the shipping lanes, was tracked, engaged, and violently sunk by a United States Navy Virginia-class nuclear-powered attack submarine. It was a flawless, textbook execution of American undersea dominance. But the bombshell revelation was the crew composition of that American submarine. Embedded deep within the Combat Information Center of that Virginia-class boat, actively participating in the sonar tracking, the fire control calculations and the execution of the kill chain, were officers and sailors of the Royal Australian Navy. How did Australian submariners end up fighting and killing Iranians from inside an American nuclear submarine? It is the direct, kinetic manifestation of AUKUS Pillar 1. Under the AUKUS agreement, long before Australia receives its own sovereign nuclear submarines, Australian personnel must be trained. For the last 3 years, elite RAN submariners have been integrated into the U.S. Navy's nuclear training pipeline. They have graduated from the Nuclear Power School in South Carolina. They have completed their prototype training. And crucially, they have been assigned to active-duty U.S. Navy Virginia-class submarines to earn their dolphins and gain vital real-world operational experience. When the Iran war erupted, those Australian sailors were already on board. They didn't disembark. They went to war. When the order was given to fire the Mk-48 Advanced Capability ADCAP, heavyweight torpedo that snapped the keel of the Iranian Kilo-class submarine, Australian hands were on the consoles. Australian ears were listening to the sonar returns of the hull imploding. This is AUKUS first blood. It proves that the narrative of Australian abandonment is a complete, utter fabrication. Australia is heavily engaged in the fight. They are bleeding the adversary in the electromagnetic spectrum with the wedgetail, and they are executing lethal, kinetic strikes in the undersea domain through the deeply integrated AUKUS pipeline. Australia didn't say no to fighting. They said no to fighting stupidly. They refused to provide a highly visible, vulnerable surface target for Iranian propaganda, and instead chose to wage a highly classified, shadow war that maximizes their unique technological and human advantages while preserving their strategic fleet for the true threat in the Pacific. The economic meat grinder. While the military logic of refusing the deployment is sound, the decision made by Prime Minister Albanese was also driven by a massive, terrifying, and rapidly deteriorating domestic reality. Geopolitics is not played in a vacuum. It is played in supermarkets, at petrol pumps, and in the bank accounts of the civilian population. And in early 2026, the Australian population was experiencing the brutal, unfiltered reality of supply chain warfare. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, the global energy market collapsed. For Australia, a massive, continent-sized island that has systematically dismantled its domestic oil refining capacity over the last 20 years, the crisis was existential. Australia imports over 90% of its refined liquid fuels, diesel and jet fuel, primarily from mega-refineries in Singapore and South Korea, which in turn rely heavily on crude oil from the Persian Gulf. The moment the strait closed, the 20-day death spiral began. The spot price of diesel in the Asia-Pacific region tripled. Australian petrol stations saw massive surges in demand as panic buying set in. The logistics networks that transport food across the vast outback began to fracture. The massive iron ore mines in the Pilbara, the primary engine of the national economy, were forced to throttle back operations to conserve diesel. The political pressure on the Albanese government was immense. The domestic opposition, fueled by terrifying economic indicators, screamed that the Prime Minister was committing economic suicide. They argued that Australia must send its warships to the Middle East to force the strait open, because the nation would literally starve without that oil. This is the ultimate agonizing paradox of Australian grand strategy, refusing to protect the exact maritime arteries that the nation's economy relies upon, in order to protect the nation's physical sovereignty from a future threat. The Trump dynamic and the forever war. To navigate this domestic nightmare, Albanese had to execute a high-wire political maneuver. He had to publicly distance Australia from the war strategy of the United States, and specifically, the unpredictable, highly transactional foreign policy of the newly established Trump administration. In Washington, the Trump administration was operating on a platform of America first, allies must pay. The messaging from the White House was aggressive. The United States would secure the shipping lanes, but the nations that benefited from that oil, like Australia, Japan, and Europe, must provide the physical hulls and bear the financial cost of the operation. But Albanese, reflecting the hardened, realistic mindset of a modern middle power, refused to be bullied into a blank check. In a series of highly publicized, globally broadcast press conferences, the Australian Prime Minister articulated a stance that fundamentally redefined the US-Australia alliance. He stated that while the alliance remains the bedrock of Australian security, Australia is a sovereign nation that will not be dragged into an open-ended, attritional conflict without a defined exit strategy. He publicly demanded certainty of objectives from the Trump administration. What is the end state? Canberra asked. Are we simply swatting drones out of the sky forever, spending millions to defend pennies? Are we attempting to enact regime change in Tehran? Are we preparing for a massive ground invasion? Without a clear, achievable, and geographically contained objective, Australia refused to commit its finite, irreplaceable surface fleet to the meat grinder. This was a profound political fracture. It was not a severing of the ANZUS Treaty, but it was a renegotiation of its terms. Australia signaled that the days of blindly following American presidents into Middle Eastern forever wars were over. The Australian government made the brutal, cold-blooded calculation of acceptable losses. They determined that an economic depression caused by a global energy shock, while devastating to the incumbent government's polling numbers and painful for the civilian population, was a survivable trauma. The global market would eventually adapt. The US Navy, out of pure self-interest, would eventually crush the Iranian blockade. But if Australia sent its naval shield to the Middle East, and China capitalized on the Pacific vacuum to launch an invasion of Taiwan or establish hegemony over the first island chain, the consequences were not temporary. They were permanent, civilization-altering, and existential. Albanese chose the pain at the petrol pump over the subjugation of the Pacific. A sovereign middle power. The refusal of the Australian government to deploy its surface warships to the 2026 Iran war is a watershed moment in the military and diplomatic history of the 21st century. For decades, the world viewed Australia as a compliant, enthusiastic deputy sheriff to the United States. We were the ally that never said no. We paid our dues in blood in the deserts of the Middle East, hoping that in return, the United States would guarantee our security in the Pacific. But the geopolitical tectonic plates have shifted. The rise of a hyper-industrialized, aggressively expanding Chinese military has forced Australia to grow up. We can no longer afford the luxury of fighting other people's wars for the sake of diplomatic prestige. The zero-sum fleet is a reality that cannot be ignored. Every decision is a trade-off. By refusing the Trump administration's demand, Australia demonstrated a ruthless, unsentimental prioritization of its own geographic survival. We recognize that the Sino-Russian axis and their proxies in the Middle East are executing a globally coordinated strategy of distraction. They want the West bogged down in the sands of the Middle East. They want the vertical launch magazines of the free world emptied on cheap drones. Australia looked at the trap and stepped around it. We are still in the fight. The Australian wedgetail crews directing the air war over the Gulf, and the Australian submariners pulling the trigger in the deep waters of the Arabian Sea, prove that our commitment to the free world is absolute and lethal. But we will fight on our own terms. We will utilize our technological advantages, our stealth, and our intelligence networks. We will not sacrifice our primary maritime shield for an escort mission. When the strategic planners in Beijing saw the news that Australia had refused to send its destroyers to the Middle East, they did not celebrate a fractured Western alliance. They cursed, because it meant the Australian apex predators, the Hobart-class destroyers, the F-35 stealth fighters, and the Ghost Shark autonomous submarines, were still sitting in the Pacific fully armed, their magazines full, and their radars spinning. It meant the Southern Shield was intact. Australia didn't abandon the United States. Australia forced the United States to realize that the free world can no longer afford to fight two-front naval wars. The Middle East is a distraction. The Pacific is the main event. And Australia is holding the line. Thanks for watching Doctrine of War. Do you believe that Australia made the right strategic choice by refusing to send warships? Or does turning our back on the global oil supply chain guarantee economic ruin before a Pacific war even starts? Let us know your tactical assessment in the comments below. Stay sharp, stay focused, and we'll see you in the next one.